Welcome to the Holy Post. According to New York Times columnist David Brooks, our society has given up on moral formation to focus instead on individual success and happiness. Can we recover a culture of shared virtue? Surprising data shows that overall college enrollment is down, but Christian colleges and universities are growing. What's the explanation? Then Robert P. Jones from PRRI is back to unpack the numbers from the presidential election. Why did more Latinos support Trump, and are Democrats learning the wrong lesson from their loss? Also this week, animals hold grudges. We have more exclusive content this week for Holy Post Plus subscribers, including a new episode of Getting Schooled by Caitlin Chess, where we talk about the different views of communion. What's actually going on with the bread and the wine? Of course, there's much more to Holy Post Plus for you to engage, including the Sky Pod, bonus interviews, the book club, live streams, and merch. And that's just the start. We have big plans for Holy Post Plus this year with an avalanche of new content, audio, video, written stuff, and even events. In fact, the bulk of what Holy Post Media produces is now available for Holy Post subscribers only. So check it out and become part of the Holy Post Plus community at holypost.com. Here is episode 653.
Hey there, welcome back to the Holy Post Podcast. I'm Phil Vischer. I am not in the studio. We were in the studio for last week's episode, but then Caitlin had to fly away and go back to Duke, even though we said, please don't go, please don't go. We'll eat you up, we love you so. That's a quote from Where the Wild Things Are. I'm sure you're familiar with classic children's literature.
Yes.
Okay, good. Good. We have a point of cultural commonality. That is fantastic. I am here with Eye in the Sky, Sky Jitani. Hi, Sky.
Hello. Hi.
You should be doing like traffic reports from a helicopter, and you could be Sky in the Sky. That would be
Sky
so
in the
great.
Sky.
Why didn't you do that?
Why didn't I? I'd never thought that was a possible career option for me.
Oh, it's totally
You should have been my high school career counselor, Phil.
Yeah. I blame Miami of Ohio for not saying, have we got something that you'd be great at?
Not seeing the potential.
They had a little airport on campus, and they had a skydiving team that was known as the Miami Dropouts.
Oh
Really?
my gosh.
Yeah.
Did I tell you all that I went skydiving?
We saw that. I saw that on Instagram.
When did you go skydiving?
Like a couple weeks ago for the first time ever. It was the most amazing thing I've ever done. I literally got to the ground and was like, I'd do it again right now. Let's just do it again. It was so fun.
So I take it you're not afraid of heights.
I was afraid, but that's the fun. The fun is being afraid.
Okay, but you're
Phil,
not afraid of heights.
is that something you would do?
Yeah, I would. I'm not. Yeah, I've never been afraid of heights.
Let's do it, Phil.
So. Well, the only question for me, hold that thought. Now it's time for the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Caitlin. This episode is sponsored by Glorify, the #1 Christian Daily Devotional App. If you're like me, you'd probably love to start your day in the Bible, but you're never sure where to start or what to read. You should try Glorify, the #1 Christian Daily Devotional App. Start your morning with a daily Bible passage, a short devotional, and then an immersive experience called Daily Walk with God. If you need a break in the middle of your day, try one of Glorify's guided meditations or listen to their curated playlist of worship songs. At the end of the day, try a sleep meditation to calm yourself down and forget all about what someone just said about you on Twitter. Am I projecting? Right now, Glorify is offering you a free 14-day trial when you visit glorifyapp.com/holypost. Right now to download the Glorify app. That's glorify-app.com/holypost to download the Glorify app for free. Glorify-app.com/holypost. This episode is sponsored by Rocket Money. Hey, if you're like me, you want to use your money to do good in the world, to support causes you really believe in. But by the end of the month, your money's all gone. Maybe it's because, like me, you've got like 50 subscriptions, half of which you don't even remember signing up for. That app for your kids that they used like once, that delivery service, the fitness plan that didn't work out so well. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that finds and cancels your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills and free up money for the things you really care about. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has helped save its members an average of $740 a year with over $500 million in canceled subscriptions. I can see all my subscriptions in one place, and Rocket Money will help me cancel the ones I'm not using with just a few taps. Stop wasting money on things you don't use. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions by going to rocketmoney.com/holypost. That's rocketmoney.com/holypost. rocketmoney.com/holypost. And thanks to Rocket Money for sponsoring this episode. Hey! We're recording this early. We usually record on Monday and release on Wednesday, but Monday is a holiday, and so we're not really recording on Monday, so we're recording on Friday. Monday is also the inauguration of a new, I don't know if you know about this, guys. We have a new president. We have a new president coming into office. It's not the same as the old president, but it's the same as the old president. So the old president is going away, and we're getting the old president. And he was president such a long time ago, I don't really remember what it was like. I think they're
both pretty old.
Thinking it was good. Good stuff. I don't remember. Which guy is this? Are you going to watch the inauguration, Caitlin?
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, because it's historic.
It's an important historical event.
Is it more historical or hysterical for you that draws you to it?
Probably a little bit of both.
Okay.
It's kind of like the exaggerated form of all of them, where it's like we really have reality TV-ified this. So the same dynamics exist where it's like a train wreck. I don't want to watch, but I can't look away.
At any point during the inauguration, will Hulk Hogan come out and rip his shirt off? I'm hoping.
I think this is the first inauguration where the chances are not zero.
I think that's true. Sadly.
I love that. Sky, are you going to watch the inauguration? Now, of course, as you're listening to this, it's already happened, and you know what happened, and it was wild and crazy, and we're still talking about it, except we don't know what it is because we're in the past. We're living in the past. Sky, in the future, are you going to watch the inauguration so that you can talk about it the next time we talk?
I don't intend to, but I'm sure I will bump into some highlights here and there. I honestly, really, since November, I have engaged in very little political news media. And I started watching the news again more recently because of the fires in California and some of that coverage. But I have just really preferred to disconnect from the circus. I just don't have the mental bandwidth for it all.
I'm with you. I'm with you, brother. I'm right there with you. So 2 things. We said last week that we would try to find churches in Southern California that are doing work with fire victims and then help you guys connect to them. You guys offered up numerous churches that you're familiar with that are doing work with fire victims. And so we are going to list links where you can connect with some of those churches and groups that are doing relief work. And you can go to holypost.com. You can also go to the show notes of this episode, and you will find some links where you can get involved and help out. Yes, you can pray, and you can help. So that's thing 1. Thing 2, I am living pre-inauguration. But this is coming out post-inauguration. One of the things we know for certain is that there are supposed to be a whole bunch of executive orders that happen almost immediately that are generally not great for refugees and immigrants. So, what can you do about that? Here's what I want you to do, and this is not a sponsored message. We're not being sponsored. We're not being paid to say this. Go to worldrelief.org. And they have a page there. It's worldrelief.org/advocate. Okay, worldrelief.org/advocate. And they list a bunch of the major issues that are at play and how you can advocate on behalf of refugees or on behalf of immigrants, and how you can get a hold of your local congresspeople. Because right now, the message that's been sent to Washington is that the majority of America doesn't want so many foreigners around. And that's the way Washington is marching. So if you're a Christian and you actually believe we should welcome the foreigner, or at least not treat them inhumanely while we're trying to get them to obey our laws, go to worldrelief.org/advocate, and you can see what you can do to make sure that people in the government know not everybody is on board with the let's be mean to all of the people that aren't like us train. Okay. Caitlin, is there anything you'd like to add to my non-sponsored public service announcement?
The only thing I would add is go to the World Relief website and look at those opportunities and then see if there are people in your actual community that you can work on those goals with, whether it's, I remember years ago doing this with a group at church where we all kind of pooled resources and said, what have you learned that we can do? Let's spend some time talking about it together. And then hopefully that also helps you think really practically about in your own community. There's a group from my church that sets up apartments for incoming immigrants and refugees in our community. And it's local people. And there are probably local people in your area that do that kind of work, whether you have a World Relief office in your area like I do or not, that you can continue the conversation with in a much more on the ground kind of way.
Amen to that. Yeah, there's a bunch of local stuff happening in the Chicago area because Chicago has kind of been mentioned as a major target for refugee or for illegal immigrant removal plans. So a lot of people are organizing and trying to figure out how we help people, how do churches help people, how do some of the support agencies help people that are going to be targeted over the next administration. Okay, so we can help the people in Southern California that are dealing with fires. We can help immigrants and refugees that are dealing with a hostile mood in the country toward them right now. Can we help ants? Do you think, Caitlin, we can help the ants?
Who's ants?
It's time for animal news.
On Facebook?
It's time for animal news. Biologists, this is important to know. Okay, I'm going to give you, Caitlin, some really important information. You probably, as soon as we're done, you're going to want to call your dad and tell him. Because this has national security implications.
Okay.
Biologists antagonized ants and found out that they hold grudges. The ants, Caitlin.
I watched a movie about this a long time ago.
What? What are you talking about? Are you like a fictitious movie? Starship Troopers? Is that what it was when the bugs whacked us good, Johnny? That's a direct quote from Starship Troopers. So the researchers pitted colonies of black garden ants against each other in the first phase of the experiment. This seems a little mean, to be honest. Hey, let's get these guys to fight. They were either exposed to nest mates, ants from their own nests, or to ants from a different colony exposed. Each meeting lasted for 1 minute and was repeated once per day for 5 consecutive days. 1 minute of interaction. Not really, because mating was not the objective. Antagonism was the objective. So maybe that is speed dating. Yes.
There you go.
Oh, Kaylin, you're good. Each meeting lasted for 1 minute, was repeated once per day for 5 consecutive days. Ants' aggression when encountering non-nest mates increased significantly during the training phase. On day 6, the team found that ants acted most aggressively when encountering the non-nest mate colony they had previously fought, but were less aggressive towards ants from a non-nest mate colony they hadn't yet encountered. Isn't that interesting?
They remembered who they had previously had encounters with, negative encounters, and responded more quickly.
Yes, they immediately got aggressive with the ants that had been aggressive to them days prior. Because ants use odors to distinguish between members of their own nest and those from other nests, the study suggests that ants learn to associate aggression with the non-nest mate colony's specific scent. First of all, I'm kind of freaking out that you could have 10 ant hills on your patio, and the idea that each one has its own smell.
There's like a whole universe of conflict happening right outside your door.
Yes. I also listened to a piece on NPR because, I listen to important things from important people. Crows are also known to hold grudges and to hold
They're really
grudges
smart.
to hold grudges against humans in one experiment. This is wild, Caitlin. You're going to love this. And everyone who's looking for the latest and greatest news on evangelicalism is not going to get it because this ain't it. A guy did an experiment where he wore a easily recognizable mask and then trapped several crows. Didn't hurt them, but just trapped them and then held them for a little bit and then released them. The crows in the area would react negatively to that mask for the next 17 years.
And what does that mean? They reacted negatively. What would they do?
If you walked out with that mask and once you turned your face away from them, they would hit the back of your head. They would actually hit you.
Wow.
They will hit you. Yes. But it wasn't so. It was multiple generations of crows. So they were teaching their children that if you see this guy, we're going to go punch him in the back of the head. I know. So, and ants, although ants, they don't live as long, and I don't know if they teach their children how to do it. Anyway, animals remember what we've done to them. And, it may be payback time coming. Maybe that's why the orcas are attacking the sailboats.
Yes. I was just going to bring that up because we've not been real good to them.
Nature is rising up against us.
There's some biblical precedent for there's multiple moments in scripture where creation kind of responds, right, to the sins of humans. So here we go.
Like the kids mocking the bald prophet and the bear comes out and gets him. Yeah. I love that passage. It's one of my favorites.
The blood crying out from the ground. You love that passage.
Why am I not surprised? That's one of Sky's favorite Bible verses.
Oh, gosh.
And the bear ate the children who mocked the bald man.
Loves that. He loves that.
Yeah, just loves. I have no idea why. Do you relate to it, Sky? Is there anything?
No, just slightly. Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk about the kids. You guys actually have no idea what I'm going to talk about because I forgot we were recording today. And so I had to put this together rather quickly. But I did send this story out to you last week, but we didn't cover it. David Brooks wrote a piece in the New York Times called The Character Building Toolkit. Maybe it was 2 weeks ago that I threw this out. I don't remember. He had just gone to a special symposium at Harvard Graduate School where they were talking about, and it's funny that, the smartest people in the world are now saying, hey, maybe moral development is important. Maybe we should focus on that because we haven't really been focusing on, he says, at some point in the last, 50, 80 years, the development of kids focused primarily on their success and their happiness and not on their moral formation. He says, over the past many years, schools and the broader culture have embraced the idea that the purpose of childhood is to prepare for individual achievement and happiness, rather than, say, caring for others or the common good. And then they talk about certain schools that are trying to do that are trying, to focus on, we want to make you better people, not just better computer scientists or better financiers or better lawyers. And there are several things. He says, people's characters are primarily formed when they live within coherent moral ecologies. They are formed within an institution, whether it's a school, a biker gang, a company, or the Marine Corps. When an institution has a distinct ethos, and holds up certain standards, quote, this is how we do things here. So one of the concerns is that kids are no longer, going to school in places that have an ethos of this is how you live, this is how you treat others. And there's, character counts and people have been trying to sneak that back in, but particularly at the higher level, at the college level, there's been much less of that. So he talks about We need to teach moral skills, the skills of understanding, of being good at listening and conversation, and eliciting life stories so you can see the people around you as wholly formed people. There are skills of consideration, how to treat people well in the complex circumstances of life. There are moral traditions. It's hard to make good judgments unless you have clear moral beliefs. And we have systems of moral thought. He says, fortunately, we're lucky inheritors of many rich and varied moral traditions: Stoicism, Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, rationalism, Romanticism. Schools can teach these traditions and students can decide which seem true to them. We need to encourage deep reading. Students learn about these traditions by studying the great texts of each. We need to teach self-confrontation, that in the way David Brooks put it, we're all sinners in some way, and each of us may have a core sin. Maybe you're a people pleaser or egotistic or judgmental, or you have a temper. For many people, the struggle against their core sin is the central theme of life. Our institutions need to help people with that. It would be great if we encouraged paid public service. He says heroism is almost always the same, some good but flawed person struggling on behalf of some ideal. Community service, whether it's feeding the poor, sitting with the homeless, or championing a cause. And then he closes, he talks about a couple of different schools he's visited where they do that, where he visited Valparaiso University in Indiana, where the students in the Honors College not only study the great books, but also have to put on a musical production about one of the ideas in the books. So they don't just write papers about what a healthy community looks like. They have to create a healthy community while trying to complete a complex task. Sky.
All right.
Sky, your mouth is hanging open. To quote Mary Poppins, we are not a codfish.
I cannot disagree with David Brooks. He's correct, obviously. But here, I don't know if he gets into this in the article because you didn't send it to us, so we couldn't read it.
I sent it to you a week ago.
All right, but I didn't actually read it. So
yeah, right.
Isn't the challenge not just the fact that we aren't teaching these qualities in high schools or colleges anymore, but we've now had at least one, maybe two generations of American leaders, whether you're talking about business leaders, cultural leaders, certainly political leaders, that have not exhibited any of these qualities consistently. I mean, I think back to the 1990s, and one of the reasons so many evangelicals freaked out about Bill Clinton was the failure of his character. And
he was
naughty.
And
the argument that if you're the president of the United States, or if you're the CEO of Enron, or pick your significant leader, there wasn't just an expectation that you manage that position effectively, but that you are a moral exemplar to society in your behavior. And the fact that we have successful people who have failed to uphold those values means that we've communicated to a whole generation of younger Americans that it's optional. You don't have to have that to be successcul.
Yeah, but did we really ever have that? I mean, truly.
We had the illusion of that.
A little Pollyanna-ish. I mean, what was JFK doing with Marilyn Monroe? Huh?
Yeah, but that wasn't reported on. Is it just because
we didn't talk about it? That's
partly.
So we need to go back to not reporting on people's moral failures. Is that your proposal?
That is part of the argument of some of the, supposedly hyper-masculine, buckers of all of the moral trends that you're talking about, Sky, is we were all lying about it. Let's just be honest. Let's just do what we actually want instead of, social niceties. Right.
Go back 300 years. How many powerful men did not have mistresses?
I understand the argument, and obviously I don't want to go back to a time where everyone was just as evil and we just didn't report on it. But the difference is, one of the reasons it wasn't reported on was because there was still a sense of public shame.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So Richard Nixon, when scandals started brewing around him around Watergate, he was so ashamed of what he had done that it only took a few leaders of his own party to march down the street to the White House and say, if you don't resign, we're going to impeach you, that he left the White House and left the presidency voluntarily. Shame is gone. I mean, shamelessness is a...
I don't know that he was ashamed, because he felt like a president should be able to do those things, but there was much public shame put on him that we don't see as much today.
Exactly.
Caitlin's about to correct both of us.
It doesn't work like it used
to. Correct point of view.
Well, what I'm about to say is going to sound a little off to some people, but it part of the challenge, and I, skimming this David Brooks article just now, part of the challenge that I think is so hard to recover is not only that we do just live in a morally fragmented world. We don't all share traditions of thinking about not just what actions are virtuous and not, but on what basis, what understanding of what the world is and what kind of creatures humans are and what is the story we live in. All of that makes it really hard for us to share. We have overlapping things sometimes, but do we have a really firm foundation to base them all in? It reminds me of Alistair McIntyre, the ethicist philosopher, in his very famous book in the 80s, After Virtue, begins with this analogy of, imagine there's been some global catastrophe, and not only have we lost all scientific knowledge, but we executed all the scientists, we got rid of all the scientific literature, we just decided that science was to blame for our problems, and so we got rid of all of it. And then decades later, we discover these fragments of science textbooks, and we try and put some pieces together, but we don't have the culture or foundation that made sense of it all. And so we're just fighting over the kind of superficial parts with none of the rich background. And that's his analogy for the state of ethics in the 80s. And he's really talking about all of the 20th century. It's you got rid of these larger metaphysical questions that religions answer, but also other broader philosophical traditions answer, that say, who are we? What kind of creatures are we? What's true of the world? And we've just sort of said, and I get on this soapbox in the show all the time, but we've just sort of said that's outside of the realm of what we can reasonably argue about. Let's just argue about, should you sleep with this person? Should you do this action? Should you lie under these circumstances? And those are important questions. But to his point, we're just playing around with superficial stuff, and we can't get anywhere if we're not dealing with what is the culture and foundation and ultimate meaning that makes any of that make sense. I was just having a conversation with someone a couple weeks ago about how they really believe in the ethics of Jesus, but they don't believe he was God. They don't believe he rose from the dead, and they don't know why they have to. And I thought, well, to a certain extent, that makes sense. He said some nice things about turning the other cheek. He said some nice things about caring for vulnerable people. That makes sense up to a certain point. When you get to the point of, am I willing to sacrifice the quality of my life? Am I willing to sacrifice my life itself on behalf of these values? Suddenly you need a story where resurrection is a part of it. You need a story where he was God to make sense of it. And I'm not saying everyone needs to sort of be coerced into all of these beliefs, but I just think we have to be honest about the fact that without a shared understanding of the metaphysical story that gives shape to our ethics, we're going to keep having this problem.
So I don't disagree with you, Caitlin, but that's the same argument I've heard from the post-liberal Christian nationalist folks.
I knew you were going to say that. That's what I knew you were going to say.
I mean, their argument is a pluralistic culture like modern America doesn't have a moral foundation, which is why we need to go back to a pre-pluralist, pre-democratic, pre-liberal society in which everyone was basically a cultural Christian. So at least then we can build from that same moral foundation.
Caitlin
this is
has
some
a
of the
point
work
of view about that.
Yeah, well, the only reason I'm so passionate about it is because McIntyre, who made this analogy that I'm drawing on, wrote a ton about this. He was very invested in this question of how we deal with pluralism, how we deal with competing moral traditions. And one of the things he talks about, and I think about it slightly different from him, but I have been benefited a lot from his work, is that one of the things we have to do is stop putting all of those larger metaphysical conversations in a realm that we don't touch. And we gain some tools for saying there are different moral traditions with different foundations, and they have some overlap. And so we should focus on that overlap when it comes to how do we come to common ground. But we should also figure out how to be hospitable across different moral traditions. And we haven't done that. We've instead said, leave the metaphysical stuff at the door, leave your religion at the door, leave your deeper kind of philosophical commitments at the door. Let's just talk about the superficial stuff. And we've really robbed ourselves of the riches of our traditions. Whereas he would say, and I would say it slightly differently than him, but just those traditions we should recognize where they come into conflict by talking about it. And we should recognize where they do overlap and there can be real goodness. So where I would depart from the Christian nationalist variety is not only just in terms of coercion. I don't think these things should be forced on people, but also because I actually think other moral traditions do have things to teach me, but I can't learn them if I just stay on this level of superficial questions. I actually need to say, I'm bringing the gifts of my tradition. Please bring the gifts of your tradition. They will conflict. It will be hard. It will be really difficult in a public school, in a neighborhood, in a city council meeting. But I think what we lose when we don't do that is much greater than the difficulty of doing it.
But okay. I'm going to reference last week's show where we said our technology and our behavior is encouraging our inner ring of connections, our wives and our children we're in contact with constantly, where we probably have pretty similar ethical frameworks. We're also connected to the outer ring, which is people we've pursued precisely because we have similar ethical frameworks. It's all the other progressives or all the other liberals or all the other Calvinists or all the other Pentecostals. But it's where that hard work happens that you're talking about, Caitlin, is that middle ring. It's the people in your community that we are no longer connected to. So, and then one other thing I want to say is that when I interact with the Christian right, and that's not just theologically conservative Christians, it's culturally hyper-conservative Christians. Typically, they're pointing at sort of a mythical 1950s as, this is when America was truly America. It was the 1950s, and then the 60s went crazy, and then from there on, it's been downhill. The 1950s were interesting because we had an ideological enemy that was focusing this clash of ethical frameworks. It was the West versus the Soviet Union. It was communist China throwing out all the missionaries in the late 30s and 40s. So we had communism, which was a very clearly articulated ethical framework that was focusing us to say, oh, we are not that. What are we? We are the American way. And the American way, and then we pulled in from Christianity, and we pulled, Christianity and capitalism and free markets and some other stuff. We threw it all together. And that's what people are looking back at as, why can't we go back to, I don't know if you can go back to something like that without a common enemy that's effectively offering an alternate vision. And maybe that's why, that group is so desperate to find enemies, always looking for enemies.
I don't think it's a coincidence, Phil, that the Cold War ended in 1991 with the fall of the Soviet Union. And shortly after that, you get Newt Gingrich and the revolution of Republican politics, the rise of cable news, Rush Limbaugh, all of that takes off by 1994. And what had been a canon that had been pointing at the Soviets as our great enemy, once they're gone, it turns on the American left is our great enemy. Yeah. And since then, the last 30, 40 years, we've just been warring with each other because there isn't a great external enemy that we can unite around and agree upon.
But if you call them Marxists, and socialists, can't you just make the connection that it's in fact the same enemy?
Yeah, but that was happening in the 1950s and 60s. There was the McCarthys who were, going after communists in Hollywood.
That's all we have left. That's all we have left. Right. So we got to ride that horse till it dies.
Exactly. And so we keep looking for who are the other Americans I can be at war with, because that's the only way we know how to define ourselves anymore. Yeah.
Okay. I have one more little story, and I did send this to you, but it was several weeks ago, so you don't remember it at all. And I think this ties in. Because we've talked a lot that kids don't really see the point of going to, the little local Bible college anymore, and they're struggling, and Bible colleges have closed in New York City and other places. And in my own denomination, the CMA, they closed their 120-year-old Bible college. But this just in, Christian colleges continue to see enrollment growth. 30 evangelical colleges and universities saw significant enrollment growth in 2024, according to data from the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities. And many of these institutions are setting records. Calvin University welcomed its largest incoming student group. Asbury University had more than 2,000 students, largest enrollment in its 134-year history. Colorado Christian University was named one of the fastest growing universities in the country for the 9th year in a row. There are a few that have closed, like Eastern Nazarene and King's College. Others, including Cornerstone, Concordia, and Seattle Pacific University, have made difficult cuts. But while overall college enrollment has declined by nearly 15% since 2010, okay, so this is all colleges, 15% drop since 2010, religious schools have only declined 3%. What? So secular private universities, by comparison, have had the greatest declines, losing 18% of their student population in that same period. And evangelical schools appear to be doing better than other religious affiliated schools. So I'm going to throw out a theory. Well, a couple of theories. What is this a sign of? Okay. Here's the one that I like. It's a sign of people wanting that ethical framework to shape their kids' education. Okay, so hold that. That's the theory I like. The theory I don't like is it's a revolt against wokeism. And we want to throw our kids into politically conservative spaces so they don't turn progressive.
I'm not sure those two theories are mutually exclusive.
No, but they're not identical. They're not identical.
No, they're not identical, but they could both be factors here.
And when we're talking about Christian colleges and universities, we're talking about a wide range of places. Like, I think a lot of the people that send their students or send their kids to some of these schools, it wouldn't make any sense for that to be a revolt against wokeism based on what the school is. Some of those schools, I'm like, yeah, that seems like a pretty reasonable thing based on how that school is presenting itself publicly.
So do you think, because I've been worried for the last 10 years that there just aren't going to be any little Christian colleges left, especially the little ones, the old historic ones. And some of those are the ones that have died because the world has changed, and you do well if you offer courses online and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But so this surprised me, and it made me wonder if having a macro narrative as part of your educational assumptions is appealing and maybe attracting more people going forward instead of less. Yes or no? Caitlin, you went to Liberty University. They seem to be doing okay, except for the morals of their presidents.
Former president, yeah.
So what did you find among the student body there? Why were people at Liberty?
See, this is exactly what I was talking about, though. Why people would go to Liberty, very different, especially since I've been there, right? The way they have presented themselves is like, we are the anti-woke place. We are the conservative. I mean, some of the Christian particulars have really gone to the wayside in support of more political conservative values.
Okay.
I will say, when I was a student looking at colleges, I'd gone to public school my whole life. And I thought, I do want a Christian education. I went in thinking, I want to learn some stuff about the Bible. I want to learn some stuff about theology. But I also was very aware in my public schools I had moments, especially as an early high schooler, where I went, whoa, I'm suddenly confronted with the fact that not just I have differences of opinion with some of my fellow students, but like our whole way of viewing the world and who we are in it is so different. And I did want some greater education and what that looked like, and recognizing that even if I'm taking a history class or a biology class, it's formed by Christian ideals. As someone who's been at a lot of CCCU schools in the last few years, there are some that I think have that ideal, and I think it's really valuable. And I'm there and I think, wow, you are helping your students ask good questions, but all within this framework of these are the foundational truths that we know to be true, but also have students that are not Christians and are hospitable to them and want them to be there to ask questions. So I think it's hard to talk about any of this as if it's one set of motivations for parents or students, or as if there's one idea of a Christian school, because there is such diversity.
Right.
But I love the idea that people are looking for something that has a more robust metaphysical foundation, whether that's in Christian education, which I really love, or a lot of the people who are interested in classical education, either for their high schoolers or for people who are in like honors programs at liberal arts schools, like some sense that I need more than just an education that gets me a job. It's not consumeristic. It's not just capitalistic. I want to be formed as a person who can think well. And I think that there are certain ways that I can learn how to do that are better than others.
Amen. The backstory on all this, though, is there's a significant demographic bubble that higher ed is facing. There are just frankly fewer young people of college age to fill all of these schools than there used to be. So with fewer young people
of declining birth rates, the monster.
Exactly.
The demographic cliff.
Last week.
So there's a demographic cliff, and with a shrinking number of customers for higher ed, some of the weaker in the herd are going to have to be culled, right? They're just not going to survive. And I think part of what's going on
I don't think they're being culled. I just think they're dropping dead. That's a little different.
They're just dropping dead. Fine, right? The weak is survival of the fittest. We're not actually going out and killing these schools, but they're dropping dead.
Good.
Yeah. Anyway, but I think part of what's going on here is as some of the weaker Christian schools close their doors, the students who were there or the students who would have gone there, I think, are less likely to go to a state university. They're going to look for another Christian college. And so that customer pool is less likely to dilute by going to a big university. They're going to look for another Christian college. So I think the universe of CCCU students is going to, they're going to hang on to those students more than secular schools where students might be open to going to multiple different kinds of schools. Does that make sense? Am I communicating that at all?
Yeah, but I don't think Caitlin likes it. I don't think Caitlin likes it at all.
Well, I will say one thing I have heard at so many of the CCCU schools that I have been at in the last couple of years is that they are no longer, when they ask students what other schools they considered going to, it used to be, it was like all within a general range of the Christian schools or the big name Christian schools. Increasingly now it's the 5 other closest schools to here. Like that is increasingly true for people. So that's, I think, a strange opportunity and also just a new reality for some of these schools to grapple with, that it's no longer, a subset of youth group kids looks at these 10 schools on their side of the country. It's now like, oh, I'm a Christian, so this is an option, but it's not necessarily a better option than any of these others. The other dynamic that lots of journalists have covered, and this is true, I think, of CCCU schools, I'm more confident that it's true of seminaries, where it's the places that are the most denominationally specific or politically, maybe not extreme, but politically specific, partisan, that are growing. And it's the places that are non-denominational and less partisan that are shrinking. And that's what concerns me, not only because I have a preference for the less denominationally specific and the less partisan, but also because those are places where there is a greater diversity of thought. And I want that to exist in Christian education. And it is distressing to me that whether it's more progressive or more conservative, those are the places that are thriving more.
Yeah, well, I do wonder about that too.
It's much easier for parents to get scared by stories they hear about the schools with some academic diversity. You know, did you hear about the professor who said this at Calvin? Oh, no, I can't send my kids to Calvin. Although Calvin just had their biggest enrolling class in, a decade.
That was encouraging to me. I was excited about that.
Yeah, I know. And Asbury, too. So, I don't know. Sky, is this good news? And how can we use it to help kids learn to socialize and become more ethical people and save society?
Overall, it is good news. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that Christian higher ed is not collapsing completely. And I think it's also good news. This is kind of a backhanded compliment, but I think it's also good news because the CCCU schools I've been to over the years, I think, are far more effective at making disciples of Jesus than most churches I know. Oh. So students who are in those campuses and have opportunities to meet with professors and leaders who are mature in their Christian faith, go to chapels, be involved in Bible studies and groups. Like, there's a formative reality of living on campus with a bunch of other young people who are seeking after Jesus. And I know people who've grown up in churches who learned almost nothing about the faith, who go to a CCCU school and they're awakened to the faith and are shaped in it in a meaningful way. And so I would hate to see the American church lose those institutions of formation, because our churches aren't doing a great job and those schools are doing far better. And I'm grateful to hear that they're doing well. I just want, like Caitlin said, I'm worried about them running after the political right or the Christian nationalist thing to keep their numbers up, because I think that would be malforming disciples, but that's a real temptation right now.
Or losing any Christian distinction. It feels like those are the two options. It's like go in the hard right political direction or kind of get rid of any specific Christian identity.
Yes.
Okay. Fantastic. So Christian colleges can actually help. And like last week, I said, my big takeaway was bring back youth group culture without purity culture, because we need to get our kids away from their phones and socializing free form. What, Sky? Why you roll your eyes at me?
Because that means you're advocating impure youth groups.
Yeah,
impure?
Phil
wants youth groups. He just doesn't want them pure.
Impure culture youth groups. None of that purity stuff.
That's
not what he wants. Dirty youth groups.
It did some damage. It did some damage.
That's true.
When taken, I don't think that should be the primary focus of how we're teaching our children to interact with the world. That's all I'm going to say about that. And Go to the website, find out how you can connect with some churches in Southern California that are doing some good. Go to worldrelief.org/advocate and find out how you can send a message and get involved in helping immigrants that are about to have the shoe drop on them by the new administration. And if you see ants or crows in your yard, don't cross them because they will remember.
This is scary.
And you will be sorry. Yeah, it is. Okay. Thanks, guys. We got a good guest. Stay around. Go to Holy Post Plus. There's lots of stuff that's being made there all the time. You'll love it, and it helps us keep making more stuff. And we will see you next week. Bye. The Holy Post is sponsored by the J29 Coalition. Being a pastor has gotten a lot harder in recent years. Toxic tribalism and political polarization in our culture is in our congregations as well. Shepherding divided people toward the way of Jesus is a huge challenge. Wouldn't it be great to have a trusted group of pastors to walk with during divisive times? The J29 Coalition is a network of theologically conservative pastors committed to recapturing the evangelical political imagination, anchoring it in the teachings of Jesus and his kingdom. Through their J29 cohort, they've designed a 3-month program specifically for working pastors like you. You'll find encouragement, support, and a vision for your congregation's future. Together, we can shape a movement that reflects the priorities of Jesus, not the pressures of the world. Visit J29Coalition.com today to learn more and sign up for the next cohort. Guide your church into a Christ-centered approach to politics. Visit J29Coalition.com.
You know that I'm a skeptic. I like things to have evidence, proof, data. I like to research things before I commit to them. And that even goes for my supplements. I want to know that they're high quality. That's why for the last year I've been drinking AG1. Unlike many supplement brands, AG1 conducts relentless testing to set the standard for purity and potency. I know I can trust what's in every scoop of AG1 because it's tested for 950 contaminants and banned substances, while the industry standard typically only tests for 10. AG1's ingredients are also heavily researched for efficacy and quality, and I love that every scoop also includes prebiotics, probiotics, and digestive enzymes for gut health. So, if you want to replace your multivitamins and your digestive aids, your immune support into just one simple scoop, start with AG1. Try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D3 and K2 and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first subscription at drinkag1.com/holypost. That's drinkag1.com/holypost. Go check it out, and thanks to AG1 for sponsoring this episode. This week, Donald Trump was sworn in as the 47th President of the United States, marking one of the most surprising political comebacks in American history. Robert Jones is back to talk about the data from the 2024 election results and help us understand how Trump did it. I also talked with him about what lessons the Democrats should learn from their defeat and why I'm worried that they're actually learning the wrong lessons. He also has some advice for church leaders about how to navigate the next 4 years and the challenges that our communities and congregations are likely to face. Robert P. Jones is the president and founder of PRRI, the Public Religion Research Institute. He's been on the Holy Post before to discuss his best-selling books, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. Here's my conversation with Robert Jones. Robbie Jones, welcome back to the Holy Post.
Hi, thanks. Glad to be back.
I'm happy you're here. So last month we were together at Notre Dame for a post-mortem on the election that included some researchers like you, some academics, some scholars, some media folks, church leaders, others, and you presented data that you'd gotten from your research as well as exit polling on the 2020 election. And I don't want to spend our time just rehashing what people can get elsewhere and other sites, including your own, on the data. But I want to ask you what stood out to you from the data about 2024 and the outcome of the election that maybe you weren't anticipating?
Well, I'm not sure if I wasn't anticipating it, but I do think what stood out is really how little changed in the voting patterns of Americans, given the really unique circumstances of this election. I mean, we had, the kind of rare issue of a president who lost an election, sat out 4 years, was twice impeached, a convicted felon, and then running for re-election again, right? And so given that unprecedented circumstance, I think what was really remarkable is how little change in the voting patterns, and particularly among religious voters, right? That we had, just to kind of, break it down pretty simply, we had about 2/3 of all white Christian voters voting for Donald Trump. And it was a mirror image for Christians of color. About 2/3 of them voted for Kamala Harris. About 2/3 of non-Christian religious Americans, so Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, et cetera, about 2/3 of them voted for Harris. And about 2/3 of the religiously unaffiliated voted for Harris. The one group that kind of stood out that doesn't really fit exactly that pattern were Latino Protestants, who, as you know, tend to be charismatic, evangelical, and so I think are very tightly aligned with white evangelical Protestants. But on the whole, like that's the pattern, and that's really has been the pattern for decades, in the country.
Right. Okay. So your data, which I was looking at before we were recording, found no surprise. White evangelicals are Trump's strongest supporters. 85% of them are still backing him. And I want to talk about this Hispanic thing, though, because among white Christian voters, whether they are mainline evangelical or Catholic, if you're a white Christian of any of those traditions, you're voting pretty much overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. But there's this weird split among Hispanic voters where what your report says among white evangelical Protestants and white Catholics, higher church attendance correlated with higher support for Trump, but white evangelical Protestants, Hispanic Catholic voters were more likely to vote for Harris, but Hispanic Protestants were more likely to vote for Trump. So how do you explain that split between Hispanic Catholics and Protestants when you don't see that kind of split between white Protestants and Catholics?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So, just to kind of take the white side of the equation, right? So we found, again, more than 8 in 10 white evangelical Protestants voted for Trump, and then about 6 in 10 each of white Catholics and white non-evangelical Protestants, so white mainline Protestants, also voted for Trump. So kind of, difference of degree, but still solid majorities of all white Christian subgroups there. Among Latinos, there is this really remarkable religious split in the Latino community. And actually, it's a three-way split. So it's actually a Catholic, Protestant, unaffiliated split, if we really break it all the way out. And what we find is that Latino Protestants, who again tend to be kind of charismatic and more evangelical, Pentecostal in their orientation, about 6 in 10 of them voted for Trump. But Latino Catholics kind of flipped the other way. Majority, kind of low 50s, majority voted for Harris, and Latino religiously unaffiliated Americans also voted majority for Harris. So the lines are kind of Protestant leaning toward Republican candidates and Catholic and unaffiliated leaning toward Democratic candidates.
Which, so that makes me assume that those more evangelical leaning Protestant Latinos are engaging in the same media or maybe the same religious authorities that are also informing white evangelicals. So they're kind of swimming in that pool. But going all the way back to like 2015, when Trump first emerged on the scene and was a candidate in the Republican primary, there was very early data that said evangelicals who attended church regularly were less likely to support Donald Trump than some other Republican candidate. And that's now very much changed, where the more white or Latino folks go to evangelical churches, the more likely they are to support Donald Trump. Does that represent a shift in what they're hearing in their churches, from their pastors, from their religious leaders? Or how do you explain that higher church attendance in evangelical communities means higher support of Donald Trump?
Yeah, this is really important. I've often called this the zombie myth about white evangelicals. I call it because it's like a myth that just will not die. Mm-hmm. And the myth is, right, that it's what you might call like evangelicals in name only are the ones who really support Trump. That's the myth. Right. In other words, that if you go to church, it's a mitigating factor in support for Trump. And it's just not true. And there was, as you say, there's a kernel of truth to it. And that was that back in 2015, and the key here is before Trump became the nominee, the Republican nominee for president, and the primary field was more wide open, we did see this phenomenon that the more church-going evangelicals did tend to support other candidates. And if you remember, there was Mike Huckabee, there was Ted Cruz, and there were other options that people tended to gravitate toward early in that race. But it didn't last that long, really. And so everybody was expecting that on Super Tuesday, way back, in 2016, that would be kind of the end of Trump's presidency, because you'd have a lot of southern states, and this would be like where he'd run into this evangelical wall. And what actually happened is that Trump mopped the floor with Cruz and Huckabee from Michigan to Mississippi on Super Tuesday in 2016, and became the Republican nominee. And ever since then, it really has flipped the dynamic on its head. And that ever since then, it has always been true. Every survey we have had, it is church-going evangelicals that are far more supportive of Trump and his agenda. So like all the, and I think in some cases, it's because many evangelical leaders realize that there are so many things about Trump that are just not justifiable in their support for him. And so there is this kind of like face-saving move that it's not really us. It's those people just claiming to be evangelical. But the data really doesn't support that. There really are. It's not that white evangelicals are holding their nose and supporting Trump. His favorability rating, ever since, again, he's become the nominee, I don't think I've ever seen it below 60%, and it's been as high as 80%.
Well, this is the other myth that I think needs to be put to rest. Going again back to 2016, there was a lot of rhetoric from evangelical leaders and evangelical voters that they're holding their nose to vote for Donald Trump. And there have been many, many, many off-ramps where they could have left the Trump train, to mix all my metaphors, whether it was impeachment, whether it was January 6th, whether it was this more recent election and the other nominees, Nikki Haley, others who were contenders. Like, there were many other options that evangelical voters had if they were politically conservative and pro-life other than Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And yet now for a decade, we have seen every chance they've had to be done with him, they just go back for more and they support him. So there's no questioning that no one's holding their nose anymore who said they were for Donald Trump. They are taking a deep whiff of what he's putting out there. So let's talk about the Democratic side of things. And this is where I thought the postmortem we attended at Notre Dame was kind of interesting. A lot was made of the fact that Donald Trump made inroads with Black voters and Latino voters. And he basically made inroads with every demographic over 2020. And that was pretty shocking for the Democrats. If you were explaining this to Democrats, if you were advising them, I know that's not your job, but if you were trying to tell them, hey, what went wrong, what would you tell them?
Well, I think I have been in the camp of saying it's really important not to overread the results of this election. Mm-hmm. It was an amazingly close election, no matter what Trump wants to claim about this being a mandate election. We didn't reach 51%. It was very, very close. You could take a few 100,000 votes and move them around in the key swing states and come out with a different election outcome, right? It's just that close in the Electoral College. And so I wouldn't want to overread it. Having said that, it is important, I think, particularly among Latinos, to kind of look at those numbers, what was going on in those numbers. But I do think it's a very complex picture. And one other reason not to overread just the U.S. context is I think one of the things that came out in that Notre Dame postmortem that both Professor Sam Perry and I both pointed out is that if you look at, there was kind of an international economic headwind blowing.
With inflation and post-COVID.
And what we saw, if you look around the world, parties in power in developed countries lost pretty much across the board in elections that were held in 2023 and 2024. And the U.S. is no exception. And in fact, the Democratic losses in 2024 were some of the narrowest losses among developed countries and parties in power. So I think there was this economic headwind. And when you look at the Latino data, again, I don't think that the read of the Latino data was necessarily that they were so on board with President Trump's agenda, but they were very much economic voters and very economically concerned and stressed. And, I think that one of the things that Harris never quite did was distance herself enough from Biden to say, sure, you can expect something different, from me as president. It won't just be more of the same.
Okay, so I get that, and I agree with you, but I have multiple concerns.
Yeah.
One is the Democratic Party could look at what happened this past November and say, well, yeah, there was inflation, and that's always hard, and there were headwinds, and we saw other democracies around the world where incumbent parties got voted out, and they can read all of that as, we don't really need to fundamentally rethink anything. We had an old candidate, we put in a new candidate too late in the game, and she made a few mistakes here and there, and the headwinds and all that. So let's just stay the course, not really do a deep reflection on where our party is or what we stand for, and Trump will implode and his party will screw up in the next couple of years and we'll be back. And so no major adjustment necessary. What that doesn't factor in, and where the international headwinds argument, I think, doesn't quite work, is I can't think of another incumbent party that lost to somebody who was an indicted felon who tried to overthrow a previous election and who has basically shown complete contempt for the Constitution of that country. Like, Trump is not a typical candidate, and yet he still won. And what does that mean for the reflections the Democratic Party might need to do?
Yeah, well, I think it's kind of a two-edged sword here. I would love for the Republican Party to be thinking about their support of such a candidate.
Yeah, but they won, so that's not likely to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I think it's right that to kind of say, I think it's always right. When you lose an election, you can chalk it up to low turnout and the people who really supported you stay home. And there's all other kinds of arguments to make there as well. But I think you're right. You do have to kind of take the defeat seriously and say, because even those people who didn't turn out, that means they didn't think there was anything worth turning out for.
That's right.
And so I think that's really important as well. And many of those voters were minority voters in pretty key places like Philadelphia and Detroit. And I also, say here that, so I think that's important to kind of think about. And one of the things I think they've got to think about is that I don't think they address the economic concerns. I do think the ideas of, the kind of resting a little bit on the history of claiming to be the party of working class America, I think without really putting that front and center to their agenda, I think they sort of Democrats paid a price for that, in this election cycle. And then I think the other thing we're still dealing with, frankly, is, I do think we're in a backlash moment. And I think the Democrats haven't quite figured out how to respond to this in a post-Obama, post-Black Lives Matter moment that Trump really is skilled at manipulating. The other thing to say is that not just the kind of personal characteristics about Trump, but the other thing to say is that this was, in my mind, the most racist campaign that's been run since George Wallace ran, just overtly racist campaign. And yet he still appealed to more Americans than not, right?
And so, more Americans of color.
Yeah, I think I will say this, that the support among African Americans that people were seeing in some early polls did not actually turn out to be. There was some movement, but it's not big. But the movement on the Latinos was big and significant. Right. And I think that certainly can't be ignored. And so there's this question of whether the Latino voters who tend to be, this is the other, I think, challenging thing. And we'll see. I think with the midterms, we'll see whether this comes through. But I do think the other challenge is that I think many Latino voters didn't always hear the most extreme things. They tend to be lower information voters, and what they knew is what they know, right, is that the Biden administration hadn't really relieved the economic pressure that they felt. Inflation was down, but prices were not.
Right.
And I think that was just really key for that group.
There's no doubt that inflation and prices were a huge weight on the Biden administration and Kamala Harris. Is there any data? Have you seen any evidence that cultural issues played a factor in moving numbers towards Trump? And one of the things that came up in the postmortem at Notre Dame and that I've talked to others about is that ad that I seem to run into every time I was watching football on Sunday afternoons on the NFL. It was, the anti-trans ad where she's for they, them, he's for you, which they just really drove deep into the final weeks of the campaign. And at Notre Dame, when that issue came up, it felt like some of the panelists were like, it wasn't that, it was dismissed as not that big a factor because there's such a tiny percentage of people for whom, they're transgender. And so what does the data say? Do you have anything about that ad in particular or about cultural issues as a factor in this election?
Yeah, well, what we know is particularly among that those are very effective for a Republican base. So we know that that's one of the reasons why those ads are running, and they were running nonstop. When I was in Arizona and in Georgia, swing states, and when I flipped on the TV or was listening to the radio while I was there ahead of the election, you're right, is all you heard, and it was that transgender ad over and over and over again. And those final weeks are really about base turnout. So those ads weren't really targeted at persuasion. Those ads were really targeted at kind of turning out the base and kind of getting people riled up. And I think they're quite effective. And the one thing I'll say about that, and I do want to address the other side of it, but those ads, I think, and one of the reasons why what's remarkable to me is that we have seen what you don't hear anybody talking about anymore is same-sex marriage. Right. If we kind of rewind to 2024, it's all you heard was same-sex marriage is going to be the end of heterosexual marriage. And like that, that's the...
You mean 2004?
Sorry, 2004. Yes, right, 2004. Yeah. Right, back kind of George W. Bush era, the values voters election and all that. That's what you heard: abortion and same-sex marriage always in the same breath. And people like Dobson saying, yeah, it's going to be the end of marriage as we know it. And all that language has gone away largely because opinions have moved so much on that issue. And so the pivot has been then to just narrowly focus in on transgender people. And I think the real reason for that is because it's still the group of people that many Americans don't know, and that don't know that they know someone who's transgender, whereas some people have come out, right, that people do know people who are gay.
And then this came up again at the Notre Dame panel, and this was... I disagree, honestly, Robbie, and here's why. The night before I was at Notre Dame, I was at my high school daughter's basketball game, and thousands of families and that's the image that came back to when this topic came up at Notre Dame. I was thinking back to that high school auditorium, gymnasium full of people, and I said to one of my colleagues who was with me at Notre Dame, I said, you know what? If they had stopped the middle of that game and someone came out on a microphone and said, how many of you personally know someone in your life who is either transgender or struggling with their gender identity, I guarantee every adult in that arena would have raised their hand. And in my family, we all know people, especially young people, high school, college age people for whom this is a relevant issue. And I think that wasn't the case 5 years ago. It wasn't the case 10 years ago. The speed with which this issue has engulfed a lot of American communities and families and schools and the bathroom stuff. We kind of roll our eyes about it because it is used by the right to scare people. But part of what gives it traction is we can all identify somebody in our lives, in our communities, in our families for whom this is a very live issue. And I think the Trump campaign leveraged that in a way that my hunch is more Americans know a young person who's struggling with their gender identity than probably know a same-sex couple who's married. And what I heard at Notre Dame was a dismissal of that as a live issue. And I'm not sure that was the case.
Yeah, I don't want to be dismissive of it, but I do think there's a difference between knowing someone who's transgender, and we have polled on this. I mean, it's still only about 1 in 5 Americans who say they know someone who's transgender, but that's different than saying someone's struggling with their gender identity, right? I think that's a much bigger pool.
And I'm guessing they're not polling for youth and for
I mean, that's
under
overall,
18.
That's all Americans. About 1 in 5 all Americans, and it's absolutely correlated with age. So the younger you are, the more people say, yes, I know someone. But I do think what you're right about is that we always know there's a kind of a challenge when things are changing very fast, right? So we saw this with school desegregation, right? Mm-hmm. When that came all of a sudden, it puts people back on their heels. It puts people are kind of struggling to kind of wrap their heads around it. And I do think you're right that this issue the transgender issue in particularly has come to the fore very fast for many people. And schools are one of the places where it has come very, very quickly. And I think that's why you'd also hear those ads referring to schools and, so these false claims and like crazy made up claims, like your son's going to go to school in the morning and come back your daughter, right? Those kinds of outrageous claims there. But I think they're playing on something real, and that is this kind of perception of how quickly this has changed. And when we've also polled about, it is wildly generational. That, for example, if we ask people, do they think there's more than one gender, or even to put themselves on a kind of gender scale, do you think you're kind of more one pole or the other, or is there a middle at all? The differences between sort of people under the age of 50 and people over the age of 50 are huge on this issue. And I think there is that leveraging of that as a kind of it's its own kind of single issue, but it's also a bigger sign of things that are changing kind of out from under us and behind our backs and in ways we don't understand or approve of. And it's scary. And I think that's what's being played on.
Yeah, I talked to a friend during the election who is wealthy and has funded Democratic candidates for years. And I was surprised to hear from him that he was seriously thinking about voting for Donald Trump in this election. And when I asked him why, it was this kind of stuff. He just felt like the Democratic Party, for him, that they, them, he's for you ad wasn't that it was so much about transgender rights. It was that the Democratic Party cares more about less than 1% of the population and their particular need than they do the vast majority of us who have other issues going on. But he saw the emphasis of the party being so caught up in identity politics and some of these issues that he was ready to throw up his hands and forget about it.
It's a new riff on, the old ads back in the kind of anti-same-sex marriage era was the gay rights, special rights.
Yes.
Ads, right? And it was a similar kind of thing that there's all this focus on, this narrow group and who want quote unquote special rights, and they're ignoring you. Right. It was the same kind of psychological, logic about it. And it's also a riff on the kind of party of the elites, right? Kind of cultural elites that are ignoring all of you.
Yeah. I think we need two healthy parties in this country, and I don't think the Republican Party is particularly healthy right now, but I'm worried that the Democrats receive the wrong message from this loss and don't really recalibrate where they are either on some of this stuff, which is not going to be good for the future. In the time we have left, I want to ask you about fatigue. I despite going to that postmortem at Notre Dame, I've been really fatigued coming out of this past election, and I'm not eager to talk about a lot of this stuff. And I know there's a lot of church leaders that felt like the first Trump administration from 2017 to the end of 2020 was exhausting, and they kind of just saw it as an anomaly. This will go away. And then we had QAnon and the conspiracy theories, and of course the pandemic and COVID, and then the eruption of January 6th, 2021. And then it felt like, okay, we can be done with this now. Trump lost, but he never really went away.
Yep.
And now he's back for at least another 4 years, and he's going to be in the headlines every day. What do you say to those folks who are just like, I want to go on a 4-year vacation from politics, not think about this, not talk about this, bury my head in the sand, especially if you're a church leader? Do you have any advice about how we navigate this and what a responsible leader does in this next administration?
I think that responsible leader line is exactly right. So, two things. First, I would just say, boy, my heart goes out to people in congregational leadership right now, right? Many of whom are experiencing, their churches divided over many of these issues we've been talking about. Maybe even their families divided on many of these issues they're talking about, and then trying to figure out what it means to be faithful, Christian leaders, and what does it mean to, all those metaphors, shepherd a flock when you've got a divided a flock, or a flock that's at each other's throats from time to time. So I can't think of a more challenging time, I think, perhaps in my lifetime, to be a congregational leader right now. So I think it's really challenging, and really, but also really, really important. So what does it mean to be responsible? I mean, I've been thinking about this myself. I mean, I'm exhausted in advance of thinking about all this. Like I really am looking ahead to January 20th, and just thinking, oh man, here we go.
For those who are listening, like we're recording this a couple days before the inauguration. So I think people hear this afterwards.
Okay. Yeah. So we'll be in the thick of it then, right? Of kind of waking up. But I guess the words that have kind of come back to me over and over again are, okay, yes, we can't chase after every little thing. And I think that's actually part of the strategy, is kind of flood the zone with so much stuff that you can't possibly respond to it, and you don't know which things to respond to. So I think the most important thing is going to be a kind of discernment, might be the most important Christian virtue, discernment, and then courage. And so the discernment part is about how do we find those things that are truly bright lines, right? And not just sort of like one other distraction. And so I can think about, I'll just name one that I think are truly bright lines, that for me, if we end up looking at mass roundups, deportations, and internment camps in the U.S., we've been down that road before, both here. We've seen what happens when that road gets traveled in other countries. We know where that leads, and it is nowhere good, and it is nowhere Christian. And so I think there's a real responsibility to kind of stand up and be loud when those bright lines are crossed, and maybe even, save the resources, right, for those moments where we truly are called to speak out and protect the vulnerable. So the kind of discernment there, and then having the courage to be willing to do that. And you can't do it all the time, right? You can't yell at volume 10, constantly. So finding the moments when, we really feel called, and like to use some kind of theological language. I mean, I think we're going to have to like feel for the movement of the Spirit, right? When there's a kind of signal, okay, this is something we really have to speak up for, stand up for, and this other thing, it's maybe a distraction from these things we really need to pay attention to. So there's no, I think, strict formula for it, but I think that kind of discernment and practical wisdom is going to be like vitally important these next 4 years.
Well, wisdom for sure is definitely going to be needed. I think what feeds the exhaustion is what this election has confirmed is that Trump and Trumpism and MAGA, however you want to label it, it's not an anomaly. It's not a passing fad. It is here to stay. It is the Republican Party. It is a significant percentage of our American population that affirms these authoritarian tendencies, these anti-constitutional values, and in many cases, anti-Christian values in some cases. And what concerns me is I don't feel like we have a viable alternative party with the Democrats, because they seem lost in the wilderness on a number of fronts as well. And so for those of us who are Christian leaders in different settings, congregations, whatever, it almost feels like I've got no good direction to give people other than keep your head down, preach the gospel, and focus on your local community. But when it comes to the broader stuff, I understand why many are just not wanting to talk about it. And I think that's part of what got us into this mess in the first place, is enough church leaders and congregations were not talking about public discipleship or what it means to be a follower of Jesus in the public square, which left a vacuum for all these crazy voices to come in and take that terrain. Yeah. So I don't have a great solution either, but praying for wisdom is certainly a good place to go.
Can I ask one thing there on that front? Because I wrote a piece at Time Magazine. It's the only postmortem piece I wrote. And I titled it "What White Christians Have Wrought." And the one thing that I keep coming back to is, you and I have talked before, my last two books, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy, and the other one called White Too Long. I've really tried to look at my own tradition, right? I grew up Southern Baptist in Mississippi, and looking at, when you say like it's not new, that is absolutely right. But I think that white Christians in particular do have a responsibility to look at our own tradition and ask, what was it that we didn't quite expunge from our own traditions? In the emancipation, even in the abolitionist movement, one of the things I became so clear about that I'd never really recognized before is that even so many of our abolitionist leaders that we love to be proud of weren't for racial equality
or integration.
They were against slavery, but they were nowhere near supporting social. So we've always had these kind of partial corrections, and so I think we're seeing this kind of outworking of these kind of partial half measures, and so hopefully one of the things I'm hoping for is that they'll be provided some moments of clarity, right? And there will be some moments of clarity to kind of stand up and say, all right, it is time for us to be counted on this measure. And we are for a pluralistic democracy. We're not for white Christian nationalism. That's not America. That's not Christian.
Well, you said it earlier, apart from wisdom, we need courage.
Yeah.
That willingness to stand up and be counted. And I think each leader, each pastor, each minister needs to take some time to ask themselves, what is that line? You mentioned mass deportation or internment camps or whatever, but what is that line for them at which point they must and will commit before God to speak up regardless of the consequences? And if you don't plan that in advance, if you don't prayerfully discern that in advance, when that line gets crossed, you won't be prepared to stand up and say what's necessary. Right. Yep. So I guess we can leave it there. And Robbie, thank you for your good work at PRRI. We'll direct people in the show notes to some of that, and hopefully get you back on in the future as things unfold in this next administration and as more data comes in on where we are.
Great. Well, always happy to talk with you and happy to be back.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Holy Post Media, produced by Mike Strelo, editing by Seth Gorvet. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by subscribing to Holy Post Plus at holypost.com/plus. Also, be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much, much more.